Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name's Hayden Hulsey. I'm one of the brokers here at Results Commercial. So today we're going to talk about an interesting topic. This is what happens if a property doesn't appraise. So we specialize in repping sellers, so we take product to market. So what that means is we get sellers many times saying, well, if you value my property at $3 million, what happens if that property doesn't appraise if we get an offer for that price? And we have a couple different options. It's a legit question. A lot of times we need to cross that bridge when we get there because of course we don't know, is it going to be a cash deal? Is it going to be financed? Will it be SBA? Will it be conventional? Is there an option for seller financing with a contract for deed in Minnesota? It's called a land contract in Wisconsin. So there's a lot of variables in there, but it's a good question. So let's touch on it. What happens if it does not appraise? So the first thing is, of course, usually you get some notification from the buyer or the buyer's agent saying, we have an issue, we got the appraisal back and we're short. Of course, how much are we short buying? Let's get some details. Ideally, we can get a copy of that appraisal to review it. Now there's cases where a buyer might have just spent, $3,000 on an appraisal. They don't want to just necessarily hand that over if the deal looks like it's going south. So do your best to get a copy of that appraisal. If you do, review it. Seems really basic, but look at it. Make sure the methodologies and valuations in there are legit. One of the biggest ones that I see are comps. You might look at it and say, is that even a similar property? Is it a similar size? Is it a similar area? Is the use or future use in line with the subject property? Now, I'm not saying appraisers aren't accurate, but we've seen a lot of cases where that appraisal comes back and it's short and you look at the comps and you say, that just doesn't make any sense. So a good example for you is a property that we have in St. Paul, one of the busiest intersections in St. Paul, boatloads of new development going on around it. We had a buyer who put this under contract at about $1.25 million. The appraisal comes back at $600,000. Now you can imagine, we got a problem on our hands and we can see, usually we can keep deals together. When you have that big of a gap, there's something going on. So we looked at it and we said, well, what's the deal here? It was a bar restaurant. What happened was the appraiser was pulling comps that were 5 miles down the road. Yeah, some of them had the same street name, but it's an entirely different market, 100% different market, because where we are, we're surrounded by literally, $500 million in development that's going up with new apartment buildings and stadiums and all the rest. You can't pull an old, deferred maintenance ridden problem office building 5 miles away that's trading at $70 a foot, when you're at $90 a foot. I'm just throwing examples out there, but that's the whole point there. So you look at that, and then from there, of course, our first response was, well, this appraisal just simply is not legit. So if we can, our first try was, let's see if we can switch appraisers. Now, of course, that gets a little bit complicated because that lender has their preferred appraisers a lot of times, or they'll shop it out to, 2, 3, but a lot of times the same appraisers do a lot of work for a lender. So it's not always easy to go get a new appraiser necessarily, but it's possible. It could also mean with that, you might have a new lender, which that new lender and that appraiser affects the timing of the deal. So that gets a little complicated, but that's one option. Let's start fresh. New appraiser, potentially new lender, might have to amend the PA to deal with purchase agreement, might have to amend the purchase agreement to deal with the new timing of due diligence. Now, of course, the second obvious option is cancel. There's certain cases where a buyer says, I have no interest in trying to work through this because I don't care if you say the comps are legit or not. If that appraiser thinks that the property's worth $600 and I'm about to buy it for 1.2, that's too big of a gap, I'm not comfortable. Now, what happens a lot of times that we see, depending on how legit the appraisal looks to both parties, is we'll get either a seller who's coming down on price, a buyer who's coming up on price, or a compromise of both. And we try to cut that gap because really what it comes down to is, if the comps are right and the income analysis isn't lining up and you got an issue with lease up timing or some of those pieces, a buyer or a seller might look at that and say, I agree, I don't agree, okay, that's legit, I'll come up or I'll come down. And sometimes we can get to that happy medium. So another one here that we can look at is if we want to try to keep the price the same and we want to maintain still using that same lender and that same appraisal, then we need to look at possibly a carryback, which would mean a separate note. So a lender needs to maintain their same loan to value. They can't get away from that loan to value that they have on that deal. Let's just say it's 75-25. You're coming in with 25% down. They're financing based on 75% of that appraised value because that's the independent third-party appraiser giving a value on it. So if you have a gap in there and that buyer doesn't have that cash to come up with for that additional down payment, you do a carryback. That really only works if you have a seller that's willing to do it. And of course, if you don't have debt in place already with a seller, it's a lot easier. If you have a lender there and you're not fully paying that off, you need to get consent from that lender. So it adds a few more pieces to it, but that's one route that you can go. Another important piece with that though is if you do have debt and you do a carryback, whoever's doing that carryback, they need to understand that they're going to be in a second position there. So if someone defaults, the lender's in that first position, then that carryback note would be in that second position. So one of the last options here that we usually go to, and this completely depends on kind of what I touched on with if there's a lender, is there not a lender, and then of course seller motivation along with buyer and their flexibility, would be shifting from a finance deal where there's an issue with an appraisal over to a seller finance deal with a contract for deed or land contract in Wisconsin. So now that's only if you have parties that are willing to do it. That's if you don't have debt in place. If you do already, then you're getting that consent as mentioned. And of course that changes the timing with the seller because that seller's not getting cashed out. Instead they're carrying a note. And we did a video I think on contract for deeds. That's where you're getting a certain amount down, usually amortized out over 20 years, balloon payment of say 3, 5, 7 years. So it gets a little bit more complicated because you're shifting the entire structure. And then of course it can work well if you have a seller that has some interest in playing bank because they can go collect usually what's at market or slightly above market interest rates if you're doing a seller finance deal. So I hope that helps answer some questions on what happens when a property doesn't appraise. I know there's a lot of different scenarios in there just because there are so many variables with every deal. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Of course, my name's Hayden Hulsey. Our website is resultscommercial.com, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.